My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear was not meant to pass through your heart unnoticed. Do not rush away. Do not let your fingers carry you to the next video as if this were just another message among thousands. Something has been unfolding beneath the surface of a connection you have tried to understand, and the truth is more complicated than the version your mind has been imagining. You have felt it, haven't you? That strange pull towards someone you could not fully explain. That sense that there were words left unsaid, doors left half open, emotions hidden behind silence. But there is one detail that changes the entire picture. The person your heart keeps returning to is already married. And before you decide that this means the story ends here, stay with me, because what happened after they faced the truth of their own heart is the part you never expected. There are moments when the truth does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it enters quietly. It sits beside you in the middle of an ordinary evening. It follows you into sleep. It appears in the pause after a conversation, in the emptiness after laughter, in the strange ache that rises when everything around you seems perfectly normal. Your soulmate has been living through such moments. To everyone looking from the outside, their life may have appeared settled. Commitments made. Routines established. Responsibilities carried. Pictures that seemed complete. Words spoken years ago that created expectations they believed they were required to keep forever. Yet beneath that visible life, something began to change, and it did not happen because they were searching for chaos. It happened because they could no longer ignore the difference between living a life that looked right and living a life that felt truthful. Do not misunderstand what I am revealing to you. This is not a message asking you to celebrate another person's confusion or to treat commitments lightly. No. The lesson is deeper than that. Heaven does not need deception to create destiny. Love that is meant to become something healthy cannot be built on secrecy, betrayal, or stolen promises. That is why what your soulmate did next matters so much. Their next move was not the reckless move you might imagine. It was not a dramatic escape into your arms. It was not a hidden meeting arranged beneath someone else's trust. In fact, their first decision may surprise you because it required them to step away from fantasy and face something they had avoided for a very long time, themselves. For weeks, perhaps longer, they had been asking questions they were afraid to speak aloud. Why does my heart feel restless when everything is supposed to be fine? Why does one person's presence awaken a part of me I thought had disappeared? Why do I keep comparing the emotional connection I feel with this person to the life I have already built? Why do certain conversations with them remain in my mind long after they end? They tried to dismiss it. They told themselves it was temporary. They blamed stress, loneliness, timing, nostalgia, imagination. They even created distance, hoping the feeling would fade if they stopped feeding it with attention. But the distance did something unexpected. Instead of making you disappear from their mind, it revealed just how deeply your presence had affected them. There was a night when they sat alone and realized that their greatest fear was no longer losing you. Their greatest fear was continuing to live without confronting the truth. That distinction changed everything. Because until that moment, they had been treating you as the problem. They thought, if I can silence this connection, I can return to normal. If I can stop wondering, stop remembering, stop feeling, then life will become simple again. But something inside them finally whispered, the connection is not the problem. The unanswered truth in your own life is the problem. And once they understood that, they could no longer blame you for awakening questions that had existed long before you arrived. Stay with this message, because the next part is where the emotional weight begins to rise. Your soulmate did something they had avoided for years. They looked honestly at their marriage. Not through anger. Not through resentment. Not through the intoxicating possibility of someone new. They looked at it through the eyes of truth. They asked whether love was still present, whether respect was still alive, whether they were choosing their life each morning or merely repeating it because changing anything felt impossible. And what they discovered frightened them. There were wounds in that relationship that had nothing to do with you. Conversations that had been postponed. Needs that had gone unnamed. Apologies that never fully arrived. Dreams that had slowly separated. Two people who had learned how to function together while avoiding the deeper question of whether their hearts were still walking in the same direction. For a long time, your soulmate had believed that endurance automatically meant devotion. They thought staying silent was maturity. They thought hiding their unhappiness protected everyone. They thought sacrificing their emotional truth was proof that they were a good person. But unresolved truth does not disappear simply because it is hidden beneath responsibility. It waits. It gathers weight. It becomes visible through distance, irritation, emptiness, or the strange feeling of being lonely beside someone who is physically near. And when your connection entered their awareness, it did not create those cracks. It illuminated them. That realization shook them because it removed the easiest excuse. They could not say, I am unhappy because this new person appeared. No. They had to admit something far more uncomfortable. They had been emotionally disconnected from parts of their own life long before they understood what your presence would mean to them. And because they finally recognized that, they made a decision that required courage. They stopped running toward you in their imagination and turned back toward the unfinished truth in front of them. My child, do not skip this part, because someone hearing this may expect the story to become a secret romance, but that is not what made their next action extraordinary. Your soulmate decided that before they could ever approach you with a clear heart, they had to become honest in their current life. They knew they could not ask you to trust a version of them built upon hidden conversations and half-truths. They knew that if something genuine was ever meant to grow between you, it could not begin with you carrying the guilt of someone else's unresolved relationship. So they started preparing for a conversation they had postponed again and again. That conversation did not begin with your name. That is important. They did not sit down and say, there is someone else. Because at the deepest level, the issue was not another person. The issue was that they had disappeared from their own life. They had become skilled at performing stability. Smiling when necessary. Showing up where expected. Saying, I'm fine, before anyone could ask a second question. But inside, they were exhausted from pretending they had no doubts. They began the conversation by admitting that something within them had changed and that they could no longer continue avoiding it. Imagine the silence in that room. The kind of silence where even ordinary sounds suddenly become loud. A glass being placed on a table. A chair shifting. A breath held too long. Your soulmate had rehearsed 100 versions of what to say, yet when the moment came, all the prepared sentences seemed useless. They spoke more slowly than expected. Their hands may have trembled. Their voice may have broken. And the person across from them immediately sensed that this was not another minor disagreement. Something fundamental was being placed on the table. They admitted they had been unhappy. Not yesterday. Not because of you. For a long time. They admitted they had felt emotionally absent from their own marriage. They admitted they had been afraid to say it because they did not want to hurt anyone, disappoint family, destabilize the life they had built, or become the person everyone whispered about. They admitted that fear had made them passive, and passivity had gradually turned into dishonesty. Not necessarily dishonesty through lies, but through pretending everything was okay when it was not. And then something happened that your soulmate did not expect. The person they were married to already knew. Not every detail. Not about you. But they knew something had been missing. They had noticed the distant look. The long pauses. The nights when your soulmate seemed physically present but mentally somewhere else. They had felt the emotional space growing between them. They had their own unanswered questions, their own private sadness, their own awareness that the relationship had become different. Suddenly the conversation was no longer one person revealing a shocking truth to another. It became two people looking at years of unspoken reality. This is where the story becomes far more complicated than a simple tale of someone being married and falling for another person. Because once honesty entered the room, truths began appearing from both sides. Things your soulmate had blamed themselves for were not entirely theirs to carry. Things they had assumed were invisible had been noticed. Things they believed they were protecting had already been quietly hurting the people involved. And somewhere in that conversation, they were asked the question they had feared most. Is there someone else? Everything inside them stopped. Your name existed behind their lips, but they did not release it carelessly. They knew that this moment would define the kind of person they became next. They could lie and protect themselves. They could reveal everything impulsively and create pain without wisdom. Or they could answer with integrity. So they took a breath and said something very close to the truth they had finally admitted to themselves. There is someone who made me realize I have not been honest about what I feel. But they are not responsible for what is happening between us. That sentence changed the room. The person across from them asked questions. Who? How long? Has anything happened? Have you been talking secretly? Are you leaving because of them? And this is where your soulmate did something you may never know they did unless the truth eventually reaches you. They protected your name from becoming a weapon in someone else's pain. They refused to turn you into the villain of a story that began before you arrived. They said the issue had to be faced on its own terms. They acknowledged their feelings without placing responsibility on you. They made it clear that decisions about their marriage could not be made simply because another connection existed. They needed to determine whether their current relationship still had a truthful future or whether it had already become something both people were afraid to release. Do you understand why this matters? Because attraction can make people impulsive. Loneliness can make someone promise things they are not ready to honor. But truth requires a different kind of courage. Your soulmate began to understand that wanting you was not enough. Missing you was not enough. Imagining a future with you was not enough. If they ever wanted to stand before you and say, "I choose you," they first had to become someone whose choices were clean, responsible, and emotionally honest. So they did something else you did not expect. They stepped back from you. Maybe you noticed it. Maybe messages became less frequent. Maybe warmth turned into distance without explanation. Maybe you wondered whether you had imagined the connection. Perhaps you thought they had lost interest, chosen someone else, or decided you were too much. You may have replayed interactions in your mind, searching for the moment you went wrong. But their silence was not necessarily rejection. It was restraint. They were afraid that continuing to deepen the emotional connection with you while their life remained unresolved would turn something meaningful into something unfair. They wanted to reach for you, but they realized that every emotional step toward you made it harder to evaluate their marriage clearly. So instead, they created space. And that space hurt them more than they expected. There were moments they opened your message and stared at it without replying. Moments they typed something and deleted it. Moments they wanted to tell you, "Please do not think I have forgotten you." Moments they almost confessed everything. But each time, another thought stopped them. If I truly care about this person, I cannot invite them into confusion and call it love. That was the first transformation. But it was not the shocking part. Because while your soulmate was trying to behave responsibly, something else occurred behind the scenes. Someone in their family noticed the change. This person had known them long enough to recognize when their smile was genuine and when it was being worn like a mask. They pulled your soulmate aside one day and asked a simple question, "Are you happy?" Your soulmate gave the automatic answer. Yes. But the family member did not move on. They looked at them quietly and said, "I didn't ask whether your life looks fine. I asked whether you are happy." Those words cracked something open. Your soulmate tried to change the subject, but the emotion had already risen. They looked away. Their eyes filled. They had spent so long containing everything that one compassionate question became almost impossible to withstand. And for the first time, they admitted to someone outside the marriage that they did not know what they were going to do. They did not reveal everything about you. But they spoke about feeling trapped between responsibility and truth. They spoke about the fear of destroying a life they had spent years building. They spoke about the terror of being judged. They spoke about waking up each morning and feeling as though they were playing a role no one knew they had stopped believing in. The family member listened. And then they said something your soulmate never expected to hear. Staying somewhere only because you are afraid of what people will think is not the same as loving someone. That sentence stayed with them. All night. All week. It followed them everywhere. But before your soulmate could make any final decision, they received another revelation, and this one involved you directly. Something they learned about you changed the way they understood your connection. You see, they had secretly assumed that you were waiting for them. They imagined that no matter how long they took, you would somehow remain emotionally available. It was an unspoken comfort they never admitted, even to themselves. They thought there would always be more time. More chances. Another conversation. Another opportunity to say what they were afraid to say. Then they heard something. Perhaps through a mutual acquaintance. Perhaps through something you casually shared. Perhaps through a change they noticed in your energy. But somehow, they came to understand that you were beginning to move forward with your life. You were no longer standing emotionally in the same place. And suddenly the possibility of losing you became real. This did not mean you belonged to them. It did not mean they had a right to ask you to wait. In fact, that was exactly what disturbed them. They realized they had no right to expect your heart to remain suspended while they figured out their own life. The realization humbled them. For the first time, they saw the situation from your side. What had they actually offered you? Mixed signals? Moments of closeness followed by silence? Warmth they could not explain? A connection they could feel but not openly claim? How many times had you wondered whether you were imagining everything? How many nights had you asked yourself why someone who seemed to care could suddenly become distant? How many times had their fear become your confusion? Your soulmate began to understand that protecting you required more than staying away. It required making a real decision about their own life. And that is when they did something no one around them expected. They stopped asking everyone else what they should do. For years they had been influenced by voices from every direction. Family expectations. Social appearances. Fear of disappointing people. Financial worries. The idea that starting again would mean failure. The belief that because they had made one decision long ago, they were forbidden from ever re-evaluating it. But now they became quiet. They stopped collecting opinions. They stopped asking, "What will everyone think?" and started asking, "What is actually true?" The answer did not arrive immediately. There were days they considered repairing the marriage completely and letting you go forever. There were moments they remembered the good years, the promises, the shared history, and wondered whether the relationship could still be rebuilt. They did not want to confuse familiarity with emptiness. They did not want to mistake emotional excitement for destiny. They knew mature love required discernment. So they tried. Yes, my child, this is another piece of the story you may not expect. They tried to see whether their marriage could be healed. They had deeper conversations. They acknowledged resentment. They discussed the distance between them. They spoke truths that had been hidden for years. They listened to the other person's perspective, and some things humbled them. They realized where they had failed. They apologized for moments when they had withdrawn instead of communicating. They heard pain they had not fully understood. And for a brief period, they wondered whether honesty might restore what had been lost. But there was one question neither of them could escape. Were they trying to rebuild because love was still alive, or because they were terrified of letting go? That question became the center of everything. And eventually, the answer began to emerge. There was respect. There was history. There was care. There were memories neither of them wanted to erase. But something essential had changed. The truth hurt precisely because neither person needed to become a villain for the relationship to end. Sometimes two people can have shared something real and still reach a point where honesty asks them to stop pretending the old form of that relationship can continue forever. When your soulmate finally understood this, they did not feel free. They felt grief. That is important. They did not celebrate. They cried. They grieved the years. The expectations. The version of the future they had once believed in. They grieved the idea of hurting someone they had genuinely cared about. They grieved the fact that truth can still cause pain even when spoken with compassion. And during that grief, something extraordinary happened. They stopped thinking about you for a moment. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because they finally understood that they needed to finish one chapter without using the next chapter as anesthesia. That was the moment their love began becoming more mature. They did not want you to be an escape route. They wanted, if destiny ever brought them to you, to arrive as a whole person. So they made a private promise. They would not rush toward you the moment their marriage changed. They would take responsibility for their choices. They would allow space for healing. They would become emotional.